For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups whom have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. The Rewilding podcast is made possible through financial donations from patrons. Please consider becoming a patron and support the podcast. Today I'm chatting with John Zerzan, longtime anarchist author, speaker, and host of Anarchy Radio out of Eugene. I'm excited to have John on the show. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Peter.
You know, I've been on your show multiple times, so it's nice to have the tables turned.
Yeah. Well, I'm an anarchist writer, and I've been around for centuries, and it's just been a long road. You know, I really started in the '60s, mostly as a union organizer. We had this do-it-yourself union, and it was very do-it-yourself. So that evolved rather quickly, and that was a very cool learning experience. You know, I looked around for anarchists in the '60s in the Bay Area. This was San Francisco and Berkeley, and there really weren't any. I mean, there were the Wobblies, but they were really just syndicalists, and I think the '60s kind of passed them by. So anyway, when I was then in grad school, a little later, my main interest was unionism and the origins of unionism, stemming from my own experience. You know, and how does that work, and in which ways are unions confining or carceral institutions, to put it in a kind of Foucaultian thing? And I quickly discovered that was the case in general, and at the same time studying early unionism in England, the original unions really, it led right into the question of technology. That the technology, the factory system was very confining and disciplinary. So that was, one thing leads to another. Then you have a question of maybe all technology in a way does that, or does it, you know? And so that led to civilization, you know, and domestication, the questions like that of the foundations of really where we're at now and what drives the crisis right now, and that attendant questions. For example, why does every civilization fail?
Right.
And I think, you know, now there's only one left. There's really a global one, despite cultural differences. It's the same old game of capital and technology, and the same rules. It's all integrated now, and it seems like it's all up for grabs too. The thing is, you know, in that regard, there's no place else left to go. So anyway, that's kind of where I got to, and so that led to the anarcho-primitivist thing, or the green anarchy thing. And you know, the funny part of it is that was originally just a kind of a put down, just kind of a joke. People would say, "Oh, you're a primitivist. How funny," you know. And we didn't use that word, but it just sort of stuck. And we do valorize the primitive. It's, you know, so often thought of as a put down. People are backward, or they can't figure things out. They're, you know, but we're trying to kind of salvage that word, and in the sense that if there isn't some kind of a primitive or or a simplicity kind of society, there won't even be a future.
Right.
So the future primitive, by the way, that term from a friend told me that was the name of something in French. So I immediately stole it. And my first little book was called Future Primitive, you know. So,
yeah.
So we didn't mind the primitivist part, and we were always trying to show that the anarchist part is there too. You know, you could have an authoritarian primitivist thing, I guess, but we do come from the anarchist tradition. So, and now I think that continues. I mean, I can see that in your work, and I see that in publications like the Oak Journal that I work on. We're trying to get going with issue 4, and Backwoods, you probably know about that, much delayed issue, but coming out with a big one, I guess. I've heard. I think that makes a real contribution along these lines, you know, generally anarcho-primitivist lines.
Yeah, I think
what's encouraging, because there's such a hell of a lot that isn't encouraging.
I think the first thing I read of yours was the essay Future Primitive in the collection Limited Wants, Unlimited Means. Oh. And it was just such an awesome, like, final essay for that series, you know, because it was just a really good collection of anthropology. And I had read, you know, Daniel Quinn, and that he never really recommended many books, but that was one of the books that he recommended. And so I got it and read it. And then, of course, it has the last chapter of Future Primitive. And then I got into Green Anarchy magazine, where I found the word rewilding in one of those issues. So it's interesting. It's kind of cool to see sort of how I came to your work, and then how much it's actually influenced the larger culture of rewilding and anarcho-primitivism, or whatever people want to call it today. But I'm curious too, like, how do you define anarchy? Because there's so many different, you know, ways of seeing it now. There's so many different people who are credited as kind of creating it or thinking of it, or, you know, but really, you know, to me, it's just a base level of human organization that we now have given this label. But there's so many different varieties of it, and the sort of, you know, Western 1800s or whatever, you know, philosophers who kind of started using the term and all those things. So how do you look at it, and how do you define it? That's sort of your own take, but also different from a lot of these people that are sort of maybe claimed to have been the coining, you know, people who coined it, or something along those lines.
Well, I guess what we're trying to do is enlarge the category of what is oppressive, what is authoritarian. And people on the left, the leftist anarchists, they're kind of stuck with the state and capital, that they don't see the rest of it, that this is a by the hour a more technological society that really defines and deforms the life world today. It's pretty important. And the question of civilization. I just saw this piece yesterday from Wayne Price, who's kind of a well-known anarchist in New York. And man, there's just, I mean, what he said, I don't object to it in a sense, but it just is so limited. He posed the question, is this the inevitable collapse we're seeing now? Is this going to be the ball game for capitalism? But is capitalism capital? It's a long, long essay. Every sentence is about capitalism. Never mentions civilization.
Right.
Isn't that the deeper question?
Totally.
I mean,
yeah.
Capitalism, yes, that has to go, but that's only part of it, you know. And I think it's kind of a question of enlarging or deepening the thinking as things get worse and worse. It presents itself, you know. How do you explain what's going on? I mean, you got to go deeper, I think. So, yeah, that's the effort, I think. And anarchy in general. And by the way, you know, I noticed, I was late to notice this, but 20 years ago or so, when a bit of an anarchist upsurge, so-called anti-globalization movement, you know, 99 to 2001, I noticed that the kids never use the word anarchism. They always use the word anarchy. And right there, the light bulb went on, like, you know, it's not a closed system. It's not some dogma. That's not anarchy. That's not anti-authoritarian if you set the limits. And it was just very noticeable. It's just a lovely thing to see, you know.
Totally. Do you feel like there's a resurgence of that, or that it's easier now to like get people to understand the implications of civilization now that we are like on the precipice of this global collapse? Or do you think people are still
hard to reach, maybe in denial, or I don't know.
Well, that's the question, all right. It seems like on the one hand, the technological immersion, the whole, how totalizing that seems to be, and how it's taking us further and further from human contact and face-to-face realities. That's such a huge obstacle, because people can they can agree with us, I guess you'd say, in general. You can't find people who really argue that things are going well.
Uh-oh.
To the technology. My friend Rotten, very pessimistic on that very basis. Oh yeah, they'll say, oh sure, I'm anti-civ or whatever, but they don't. They're taken so far away from any way we can try to practice it, which is where you come in. I mean, you get your hands dirty. You remind people that here it is. Even in the urban situation, you can make contact. You can remember what is still out there. I mean, that's so important. So it's hard to say. I mean, I'm kind of incurably hopeful, so optimistic. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe just because the 60s was very huge for me. So I can see that this isn't satisfying. I think people are not happy with it. And if you throw out some ideas or, connecting to what's really going on, people go, oh yeah, man, it's just grisly. It's really a very unhealthy deal, and it isn't fulfilling. The whole thing is, I mean, in that way, the system is very weak because it doesn't have the answers, and it isn't winning in terms of how are you doing? Are you real happy with the general regime? No, not at all.
Totally. So a while back, I was kind of trying to figure out the origins of, rewilding and anarcho-primitivism and who coined what, just because there was, because I'm such a loud proponent of rewilding, there's been people who thought that I coined the word, but I didn't. Obviously, like I said, I found it in Green Anarchy magazine, and then later found out that it was coined by Jesse Wolf Hardin in an essay in 1985 that he wrote for Earth First Journal, the word rewilding, right?
Oh.
And then from there, I think, ended up entering the anarchist sort of, zeitgeist, but also the conservation zeitgeist through Dave Foreman, right? Who wrote Rewilding North America, or Rewilding the West, I believe was his book. And then it took off in conservation, sadly, unfortunately, I should say, because it's not, it's definitely been a detriment to people fully understanding what rewilding actually means. But in that sort of search, I came across John Africa. I'd never heard of him before, but in some timeline I saw online, they mentioned that he was maybe one of the original people or thinkers that created anarcho-primitivism. And so I had never heard of the MOVE organization at that point. This is a few years ago now, and I looked into it, and I read all about them, and I watched the documentary Let the Fire Burn, and I got kind of really into just exploring what their philosophy was and what happened to them. And I've been meaning to ask you, like, were you influenced by them? Like, did you know about what was going on and sort of their beliefs and stuff like that in terms of primal anarchy or anarcho-primitivism?
No, I think it was more a parallel development. That was an East Coast thing, and we didn't learn about it until the late 90s or the mid 90s. I mean, we knew about the bombing in Philadelphia and everything, but and that it was generally primitivist, but very different cultural background.
Absolutely.
We were able to bring Ramona Africa out to give some talks in the late 90s, 99, 2000, and she wasn't the only one. I forget the other. It was a young fellow from the Africa family, and we love to have that as part of our joint, trying to reach out with that. But we were kind of late to figure that out, or to learn about that.
Yeah, it's awesome to just kind of see multiple forms of parallel evolution in, what we call anarcho-primitivism or primal anarchy and rewilding in multiple communities. I think of decolonization as a very similar parallel idea, not necessarily going again as far back as civilization per se, in that perspective, but still sort of kind of running along the same lines and sort of weaving in and out from one another. Anyway, yeah, I thought that was super cool. So I had to ask you about that.
Yeah, these things kind of do flow together. De-domesticate, which is a sort of more of a clunky way to say it than rewild, but
yeah,
that
totally
also has that meaning, plugging into the origins of it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, decolonize for sure. And I think we're hoping to see more connection between largely white anarchists and indigenous people on the front lines of decolonization, of course.
Yeah.
And that could be really important, and hopefully we can pursue that. I mean, times are hard in terms of communication, the whole pandemic context. It doesn't make anything easier.
Yeah. And especially just being, social media, the trap of social media and the structure that it creates, the sort of challenges it creates as a system, limiting what we can how we can communicate with one another, and encouraging, discord, encouraging arguing, because that's what gets more clicks and more, all of the things and more attention, than actually just like talking together and working things out. But yeah,
very definitely.
We definitely have a long road ahead in that regard, but
yeah, it's so easy, and there's there's every kind of social media to suit whatever taste you have. And
exactly,
I don't do social media, but I have a website, I have a radio show. I mean, I'm not outside of that, even though in terms of certain particulars, I'm not doing it. I don't have a smartphone or anything, but that doesn't exempt me or elevate me, or I have no privileged position, of course.
Totally.
So there it is. That's the reality out there. Everybody's online all the time.
Yep, exactly. Shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to ask you about symbolic thought. I know this has like pretty big implications on the way we interact today and even the origins of civilization itself. And so can you tell me what symbolic thought is, when it became a thing, and how does it change the human experience of the world?
Well, I was wondering whether it's just a coincidence that the emergence of symbolic culture parallels with the emergence of hierarchy, domestication, civilization. All that seems to flow step by step or in lockstep, and it strikes me that it isn't a coincidence. There was I have this new book, When We Are Human, and I was just sent from Feral House, my publisher. They sent me a screenshot of a review. It was all about symbolic thought. Somebody who is very upset with the notion that you could question representational thinking or symbolic thinking. And it really didn't have much to do with the book itself, what's in the book, but you could tell it was an opportunity for this guy to just go on and on. And he actually said that explicitly Zerzan is against thinking. That's just, that's, wow, where did you get that? That's really, boy, that really misses the point, I would have to say. Because right off the bat, you can think about, is it symbolic thinking when you're, say, making music or playing chess or exercising a skill? No, it's not symbolic thinking, but you're thinking. And you don't even have to point that out. It isn't the same. Language is not communication, is not the whole of communication. And, and a lot of that is kind of murky. We don't know when people started speech because there's no artifact until people started writing. So that can be a lot of conjecture. And the first piece I wrote about that, language, origins and meaning, I think it was back in the 80s, part of the series of sort of origins pieces. That is the least that's the most subject to questioning. I cop to that. And I'm sorry if I made it sound like this is the truth, with the big capital T, and I got the answer to that. Well, it was speculative. It's very speculative still, and I'm not renouncing the piece. It does follow me around, and it hasn't been resolved. It probably maybe never will, but you can raise some questions about how people do communicate, and how did they communicate? At what stage did people have intelligence? Use of fire at least 1 million years ago. There's no trace of symbolic thought or symbolic culture until relatively very recently, maybe 30,000 years ago. That's nothing in terms of Homo species, so stuff like that makes you wonder.
Yeah. I think it's one of the things that I really actually enjoy is sort of just the question itself is how much, what was the influence of that on us? And, even fire, like, I feel like there's a thing people like to do where they want to like project some idea that there's one thing that makes humans evil or bad or destructive or something. And maybe it's fire, maybe the invention of fire, maybe it was stone tools, maybe it's language, maybe it's domestication. Like, what are all of these different things? And I just like asking that question and looking at the complexity of human history, so
yeah.
Have you ever read The Art of Tracking the Origin of Science?
No, I don't know that.
I feel like you would really like that book, in part because one of the things, it's by a South African tracker named Louis Liebenberg, and he works with the Bushmen and does like wildlife conservation stuff with them. He invented this program called Cyber Tracker, where the Bushmen, in order to keep their tracking knowledge alive, because they were basically losing it, they weren't allowed to hunt, all these different things, he created a GPS that connected to a Palm Pilot. This is like before smartphones, and made an icon-based system that allowed Bushmen to use the technology to track animals and get paid by conservation biologists. Anyway, it's a really weird concept, but he wrote this book, The Art of Tracking the Origin of Science, and in it, he has this hypothesis that essentially symbolic thought or language or hypodeductive reasoning, I don't know if any of those are actually connected to this, it could be considered the same thing, but the idea that humans learned potentially symbolic thought by tracking animals, because being able to see an animal track as a symbol that is representative of the animal and then follow it is something that no other animals do, right? Like, dogs can follow a scent, there's like sensory things, but to be able to understand that a footprint is like the symbol of a particular animal is potentially one of the things that led to the idea of symbolic thinking and what he calls hypodeductive reasoning, which is like basically the idea of science, of like having a hypothesis and then trying to prove it, and potentially language as well. Anyway, I thought you might really like that book because
yeah, I'd like to run that down.
I'll send you a copy of it, actually. Louis Liebenberg made it available online as a PDF, wow. So you can read the whole thing for free. Yeah.
Great.
It's pretty cool.
I think you can sort these things out to some degree. For example, using the term domestication, that really means to change the nature of something, of something alive, a horse or a dog or whatever it is. Fire doesn't do that. You don't change the nature of fire. And the other part of that seems to me important is use of fire goes way, way, way back. Things didn't start to go south until much, much later. Totally. So fire didn't cause that. I mean, those two things right there shows that's totally. You can say anything caused the downfall. It was the original sin, if you want to put it that way. Right. But you can kind of zero in a little better.
Yeah. I think, fire, there are species that are now fire adapted, in part probably because of humans continuously burning landscapes, in the same way that there are animals adapted to living in wetlands created by beavers. So you can look at it like a keystone species, right? So we can, through our efforts, alter other, plants and animals' DNA and through natural selection by our impact. But I do think that it's and there are some people who don't differentiate, between fire adapted life forms and domestication, which to me is a mistake, right? Like, to me, there are people who I think even like I don't want to say that James Scott said this in Against the Grain, but I feel like there was some part of there where I was a little annoyed when he was talking about domestication. I don't remember if it's him actually, so I probably shouldn't say that, but there was somebody that I was reading recently, and they were saying something along the lines of like domestication is basically, any plant or animal that's been changed by human behavior. And I just don't think that's the way I would define it, right? And literally, if we think about the origins of the word dom, meaning of the house, then you've got it specifically meaning, bringing animals inside for their protection, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like there's an interesting sort of exploration that could go there too.
Well, Scott is a peasant studies guy. I mean, he's not really involved with domestication. They already have domestication in South Asian uplands that he's studied. And I love his books. In our study group here, we've read several of them, and it's great stuff. Also, he brought me to Yale in '99 to speak, and I'm just so grateful.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I love his work. I think for me too, there's this question of like, when people use the term humans domesticated fire, right? Like, what does that mean? Is that, what I'm saying? Is that a metaphor? Is it?
It really can't be domesticated.
No.
Certainly it's used. I mean, all these terms are sort of elastic, like sign and symbol. That thesis that the tracks and so forth are symbols. I would look at it more like they're signs. They signal what happened, with the growth of something or the change of something, the trace of something. I don't see that as symbolic. What would it stand for? It doesn't stand for anything. It states something, which to me is more of a sign than a symbol. But these terms too are kind of tricky. People use them in so many different ways.
So how would you define the difference between a sign and a symbol?
Well, it's the question of representation, and this has been chased around forever. I mean, I certainly didn't start that up, but when you have, you write DOG, that's not a dog, but it stands for a class of four-legged animals. They're dogs. That sort of thing is just representation and the limits of it. How does it really deliver the goods ultimately? And so there are all these theories about that, but and the whole question of culture, symbolic culture, the arts and so forth, all the ways of representing things, and where has it gotten us? When we gave up a more direct, grounded, face-to-face communication, then things start to be lost in a big, profound way. And I don't know. I think people are starting to get that there's no substitute for that. You can have every techno advance, new promise and this and that by the hour, and is it making things better? Is it delivering the goods? Are we more connected? Are we more empowered? Do we have more variety? Exactly the opposite. So come on, the massive lies of all the commercials nonstop every day, they're not proving anything. They're just, peddling stuff and hoping to get everybody hooked on
it. Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's pretty easily seen. You can demolish this stuff, critically without too much trouble.
It makes me think of, I have a friend who is not like an atheist, probably like an animist, but won't describe their belief system or religion at all, in part because of, just all the dogmatic things and projections that people can place as soon as you give a name to something. And I just love it. I basically follow her spiritual practice, if you want to call it that. But she has this thing where she says, if you want to have a spiritual experience, just go to the forest by yourself and sit at the bottom of a tree for 3 days or 4 days, with nothing. And I just always loved that because I think also in some of my, early studies, I think there was a book called like Snapping or something. And they talked about how like the only not real, but like authentic kind of spiritual or connected event or I don't know, perception, I guess, a connected perception you could have to the earth is just like an unmediated one without any cultural dogma kind of placed on it. So the idea of, you know, cults or something like that, where they're very much controlling all of the kind of spiritual, or religions even, you know, just controlling all of the ways in which you mediate with nature, with our environments. And that really, if you want to just have the most sort of authentic experience, it's to just shed all of that stuff and go out there with nothing but yourself. And it also makes me think about a lot of the stuff that you've written in terms of like shamans essentially being, you know, one of the first specialists that differentiate and created like a differential power structure within traditional societies. And I'm curious if you want to speak to that at all.
Well, that was a surprising thing, of course, from the literature, from the anthropology stuff, and it was not a great big leap of reasoning to see that they could be very powerful. They could have authority over others, and the point wasn't that they were evil or, you know, bad stuff that they were enacting, but that they did. There was this, as you say, this power differential. It was very clear. And when you when you have the effective control of specialists like that, and again, not that they exercise it in bad ways all the time, that's not true, but you can find that there was that too, because why not? I mean, that there you've lost that battle against hierarchy and against people who set themselves above others for whatever reason, you know. I mean, so yeah, that's the curious thing in it. I don't know what comes before that, you know, and even in terms of basic stone tools, you can certainly imagine that some people were better at it than others, but
Yeah.
you know, that probably didn't give them a huge amount of control in a sense of real specialist, you know, kind of being able to run things. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about that a lot too. I don't know if you're familiar with Tim Ingold, anthropologist. He's got like a really great essay on stone tool production.
Mm-hmm.
And this again kind of relates back to this idea of symbolic thought or signs and symbols and thinking in this particular way, because all of these flint knapping experimental archaeologists in the 70s were always like, you know, they kind of used flint knapping as a way of talking about or dispelling the idea that humans in prehistory were not intelligent, being like, look at how much forethought has to go into flint knapping in order to take a stone and see what you want to have completed before you do it. It requires this sort of intelligence, right?
Yeah.
But Tim Ingold has this other idea, which I think is interesting, which is that maybe you didn't have to have this preconceived notion of what you were going for to create these first stone tools that we saw. I mean, the Oldowan industry, which was theoretically the first stone tool industry before the newer one, you know, the older one was discovered more recently. I don't even know the name of that one because it's really long and hard to say. But, you know, the Oldowan, they basically, all of the Oldowan tools look the same on 3 different continents. And it's the same with the Acheulean hand axe, which are millions of years old, you know. And so his reasoning was that, you know, if you look at a robin's nest, for example, the bird, a robin, anywhere in North America, if you see a robin's nest, you can know without a doubt that that's a robin's nest because they design it the same way everywhere they are. But do they have the idea when they start working on the nest of what it's going to look like when they're finished? Maybe, maybe not, right? But if we look at these 3 different continents and we see that there's these stone tools that are made the same way in all these different places, maybe that humans that were making these stone tools didn't have that kind of thinking going into them. Maybe it was something else, more innate, the way that birds, you know, we can identify a bird nest based on its design, which I thought was fascinating and kind of, again, goes into the sort of when did people start thinking about things in this way?
Yeah, the question of intelligence itself, and
totally.
Yeah, those hand axe, they're just exquisite. I mean, they're just incredible.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's hard to think that there was an amazing amount of cognition that went into that. But things change. Things can change. I don't know if it's innate. I kind of doubt it. But domestication emerged on several continents almost simultaneously. So
yeah,
that wasn't such a great development. But
what is your theory around that? Do you have any? Have you tried to figure out what was it that could have done that?
Well, I think in general, what makes sense to me is that you've got more and more specialization. You got more and more division of labor. And I think that does sort of set the stage for another sort of a quantum leap of authority, more explicitly controlling and institutionalized with the domination of nature, with domestication. And so I think that was emerging in general. It used to be said, well, it was climate, the climate shifted. But then when you look at the different parts of the world, that's not so. I mean, It didn't happen everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting puzzle. But I do think, somehow probably there's a basic connection to division of labor. It's a very, very slow process, but at times it can, then something else can kind of jump up at another stage of it. And that was domestication. And maybe that's kind of more of a primary reason for it.
Yeah, it's just interesting that it happened all over the world. I mean, that's the thing that boggles my mind the most. What were the pressures happening on a global scale? That, and also, do you feel like it was inevitable?
No, I think that there was, what we've kind of overlooked quite a lot is in the literature, the resistance. In Search of the Primitive, Stanley Diamond, he brings that out. I mean, he talks about it in terms of being how does he put it, almost cosmic struggle, and just almost, just unprecedented. And he's talking about who's going to win. The people that wanted freedom, didn't want private property, didn't want fencing, this is mine, and all that. I mean, between basically mobile hunter-gatherers and the farmers and, agriculturalists, and that was that. And he says it was really titanic. It was not a given. There was no inevitability. And in some cases, it was won, or even reversed. People went back to hunter-gatherer, but of course, the overwhelming thing. And, it's kind of the cliche about the victors write the history. So that goes a long ways to sort of belittling the amount of resistance. Well, it was all over, so why talk about it?
Mm-hmm.
But, we shouldn't forget it. There were, primary values involved, and a way of living, a way of connecting to reality that was utterly different from domestication.
So at this point, where do you find inspiration and hope in regards to, the disintegration of civilization and the revitalization of humans and our landscapes? And
well, I've been kind of mocked for for having hope. My book, Why Hope, actually only one small piece in there was called Why Hope, was about hope, but the rest of it wasn't. And it's easy to kind of be more cynical and nihilistic about everything. Quite easy. There's a lot of evidence you could put on the side of looking at it that way. It's just stupid to think we're going to get anywhere. I mean, I think of the book Desert, 10 years ago, anonymously done, and that's the very point. You're really thick-headed if you think we're going to overcome this nightmare. Ain't going to happen. What we may be able to do is disperse and have little islands or something. And that was very attractive to a whole lot of anarchists. I think it's just too much surrender for me to really like it, because you've given up the game already. I think it's just starting. And who knows, man? I don't exactly have a guarantee we're going to really get somewhere. But I frankly think the odds are good. Look at how it's failing. The dominant order is just, man, it's ridiculous. It's just couldn't be. In fact, my weekly Anarchy Radio show is perhaps all too much filling out the week's horrors that turn out.
Right.
The chickens have come home to roost. Handwriting's
totally.
on the wall, whatever cliche you want to put on it. There it is, man.
Yeah.
Look in vain for some kind of victory for the system. Everything it touts has been, for example, the techno stuff, the answers, always a technical answer, created, they come around to offer the solution to something that they have caused in a general sense,
Yeah.
Oh, because we'll cure cancer. Well, it's not actually happening. And by the way, what caused the cancer? I mean,
right, exactly.
The whole thing is
totally
can't hold up to scrutiny. And again, if people were fine with the system on some level or another, well, we'd get nowhere, right? We'd just be flapping our mouths, and it would be to no point at all. But man, that ain't the deal. Sadly enough, that ain't the deal. Where you get the incredible opioid deaths deal, every kind of pandemic, there'll be just one after another. And this one's over. It's getting worse. In fact, I mean, this is hideous. I mean, it's just so upsetting. But there it is. And what does it tell you? And where did it come from? I mean, I don't see how people can avoid these questions, but maybe they can. Maybe the suicide rates will still keep going up, and people will take more dope, legal or illegal, and nobody will really get their shit together. That's possible.
Yeah.
I don't know, man.
Yeah. I feel like I'm a pretty hopeful person, but also not. I think it's like hopeful for what, I think is kind of one of the things I like to think about, like hopeful for what? What's the outcome that I think that I feel hope for? And I think there's like a big spectrum there. Like, are we hopeful that humanity is going to survive? Are we hopeful that, like myself, I'm going to live to be a ripe old age? Like, what is the hope? Hope that, we don't kill most of the life on the planet? I don't know. Like, it's interesting to kind of see it from these different levels. Every time I go to the bathroom, in my toilet, above my toilet in my house is a poster, and it's like a spiral of the existence of life on Earth. It's a timeline that's in a spiral all the way to the beginning, and it's just really cool to see like all of the previous mass extinctions, and how life has diversified and exploded into these different ways, and even just, the algal bloom, that the first mass extinction was an algal bloom that killed everything in the water, but created the oxygen in the air that we breathe today. If it weren't for that mass extinction, we wouldn't exist, right? And so there's some level of hope in regard to just like life going on for me, where I'm like, okay, well, like, who cares? Like on the level of humanity surviving, that's whatever, that doesn't really, that's a different thing. We can talk about that too. But, like hope in as far as life going on, like life's going to go on, and whatever is existing or thriving in millions of years from now will be thriving because of the conditions that we changed and made the planet into. That doesn't make it, as an emotional being, watching loved ones burn, watching my favorite forests burn, doesn't make it easier to think about a million years from now. Sure, there's going to be life, so what degree, like, what are we hopeful for, and I think I just keep asking myself that question, and just finding different ways of looking at that, and thinking about even like humanity. Another thing I think about is like, when the bubonic plague hit Europe, the world's temperature dropped 2 degrees in less than 100 years because of the impact on agricultural systems of Europe. Mm-hmm. When settlers, the diseases wiped out a lot of Native American societies that were farming, the world's temperature dropped 1 degree or 2. And, if you look at Plows, Plagues, and Petroleum, that book is called, Plows, Plagues, and Petroleum, How Humans Hijack the Climate or something. They're talking about how humans have been affecting climate for 10,000 years since the agricultural revolution by cutting down forests, growing grains, that don't have deep roots. So there's some level of like hope in like thinking about how the system will equalize itself, and maybe the collapse of civilization and the impact that will have, sadly, on the people living today, but will also potentially cool the planet really quickly. And we won't end up in one of these positive feedback loops or negative feedback loops or whatever of like a rising climate. So there's that's a weird, fucked up way of looking at hope in terms of thinking about a potential die-off. Not that that's like something to be hopeful for, but the resulting implications of that might mean that the planet could cool faster. And then there's hope for looking at like transition, and how we can transition and not have these sort of massive overnight collapses of population and disease and all of these things. But I don't know. I really don't.
Well, it could be a slight ray of hope right now. It's a bit of a puzzle. People preparing to come out of the pandemic, if in fact we are more or less getting a respite and coming out of it overall, people not going back to work, or people quitting the jobs.
Yeah, exactly.
Not what was expected.
Totally.
And so you see these op-ed pieces. Well, what is the value of work? What are we supposed to do with our lives?
Exactly.
Pretty primary questions. So
totally.
Maybe there's going to be a rethinking on a possibly radical level to some degree.
Yeah.
Because it isn't just, oh, yippee, let's go back to normal. Well,
exactly.
Normal wasn't so damn hot.
Totally.
Normal put us, in terms of all these problems. So yeah, and one can be hopeful, but not for sure that this is going anywhere, but it's something there anyway.
I feel like too, I asked you if you thought it was easier to talk to people now than 20 years ago or easier. And for me, I definitely feel like it is. And I don't know if that's because I'm just better at talking about these things to people. Like I've had 20 years of talking about this stuff, and maybe I'm just better at it. But I do feel like there are more gateways or doorways into talking about these things with people than there were 20 years ago.
I think that's so. By the way, this T-shirt, this was I've forgotten the word. The people that worship technology, the transhumanists. They had a weekend event in Austin, and they wanted me to come and talk. And I said, I think you're calling the wrong number here. I loathe that stuff. That's just so appalling, so unhealthy, so delusional. And they go, yeah, we know. That's why we want to pay you to come.
Wow.
And it was pretty cool, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very bewildering, but they were
amazing.
There was an openness. We had all these conversations right from the get-go.
That's incredible.
I just launched into it, man. I wasn't holding back at all. I thought, man, this is where they're going to start throwing things at me.
Right,
Running out of the place. But no, I mean, and I'm not saying it, I don't know, changed anybody's thinking or not, but it was possible.
Yeah.
And I had, what year was this? Maybe also about 3-4 years ago, I was invited to give the final lecture of this undergraduate general anthropology class, kind of the wind-up deal. And I thought, wow, they're asking me, but they were down, and I think the students were, I think they dug it, and I was really happy. Yeah, they put me up in this hotel in Harlem, and I got to go over there and talk to this big bunch of kids.
That's amazing.
That wouldn't have happened a while ago.
Totally.
And I don't know if I've gotten any better speaking. Probably a little shift, It's time to think about other things.
Yeah. I mean, that's I think too about like the shift and how fast shifts can happen depending on where energy and thought is directed. And I think about, somebody was talking to me about victory gardens in, World War II, and how within a year, 50% of the produce in the United States was grown by people in their own backyards.
Really?
Some huge number like that. And I think about this pandemic, and people freaked out, and they, I one of my most viral posts was, I was like, yeah, everybody's freaking out about the pandemic right now, but famine is what we should actually be thinking about, because this is how this is going to affect supply chains and blah, blah, blah. And so we need to be replanting native habitat. We need to be thinking about, wild foods and domesticated foods within a small scale, if that's the transition to something else, and it went viral, right? And it just, I think there was really this sort of thinking of people really want, and then gardening just became a huge thing with everybody trapped inside their house and not really knowing what to do. And I'm just hoping that kind of momentum will stay with the right people, right? And again, I just finished. Kevin Tucker recommended Joseph Tainter's Collapse of Complex Societies, which I'd never read before. And I just love that part where he talks about specialization as one of the things that you see just kind of go away when societies collapse, because everybody is then brought back to the level of subsistence, right? And so I just think about that and how important it is. And so that's one of the reasons Rewild Portland, like our theme has really been now to shift towards the concept of subsistence. And so not just because of that importance, but also because if you're, our theme for the Rewilding conference last year was subsistence is resistance. Because to us, if you're going to, if you want to build a resistance movement, they need to actually be fed outside of the system that they're resisting. Otherwise, why are they going to attack the system that's feeding them, right? It's suicidal in a sense. And I don't think humans are necessarily prone to do that kind of thing. So how do you create this system of subsistence outside of the mainstream one that then allows people to resist on a larger scale? And I actually do feel like the pandemic is inspiring that, because of this desire for people to feel more resilient at home.
Yeah, more autonomy. They learned that lesson.
Yes.
You can do it, and there it is. Then you know how to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you say, it's that thing about how if you're in the jetliner screaming straight down, you know what is going to happen, but you're not going to climb out of the window either.
Yeah, right, exactly.
You're stuck. Yeah, unless there's someplace to go.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, so that's where, for me, the hope really lies in that. And I think it goes kind of beyond hope, in the sense of just like, it actually just feels really grounding to be connecting with subsistence, with plants and animals, and be, touching the soil and digging up roots and, or whatever,
Really? Yeah.
Picking berries and the things, and knowing how to, influence the regrowth of the things that you're harvesting, right? That's like a big part of what we've been learning from our indigenous, stewards and landholders here in the places that we occupy, is how do you regeneratively harvest and maintain the ecosystems here. And so kind of just all of that knowledge wrapped together and elevating those voices. To me, that's where the hope in the moment, and a hope to a transition that doesn't really necessarily have some sort of, big crash.
Yeah, well put. Yeah, we got to have the practical skills. We got to, instead of constantly being de-skilled in so many ways, it's so clear. It's got to be the other way around. Otherwise, what's the future?
Exactly. So yeah, speaking of that, like what are you working on right now? Tell me about the Oak Journal. Is this like, Green Anarchy magazine redo? Is it similar in a sense? Is it like, how do you see it?
Well, I think it might be possibly a little more open, more emphasis on interviews, but it's twice a year, and it's very definitely in that, I would say, tradition of GA. Steve is a wonderful editor. He's a very open, non-dogmatic person to work with, and it becomes easier to reach out to people. In fact, I've come to know people I didn't know, and we've only started this thing 2 years ago, or he started it. Now I'm, I guess, a co-editor at times, and like Mark Seeley, I'm familiar with his work up in Washington State. Great writer if you run across. Yeah, he's got some great books. He just finished one about the perspective from a dog. And I said, "Oh, is it like Ishmael, the gorilla thing?" And he goes, "No, it's not like that. But I bet it's going to be pretty cool."
Yeah, huh.
So there's, yeah, and we've had some top-notch interviews, just, and I think people that aren't real well known yet and should be more accessible. Do you know the book Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta?
I have it. We got it for the Rewild library, and it's on my list of, books to read.
It's
So we
very
have
cool. It's really, it
awesome.
kind of in a certain way reminds me of the down-to-earth approach that you have in a way. I mean, one of the first kind of obvious questions you might ask somebody is, "So how'd you write this book?" And he said, "Well, I was broke. I was tired of standing by the side of the road in the rain, and they offered me some money to write this book. So I wrote it." I mean, and the whole thing is it's just so grounded, and every chapter has an artifact attached to it that he made. It's just a different style. It's just really something else. I think it's, awesome. I hope it's getting out there. I think it is. So yeah, stuff like that we're, helping to share more stuff in different ways too. I don't think we ever had any poetry in the day that I can remember, but so that's going strong. And you find out in these days, how are you going to pay for it? I mean, you've got to come up with some scratch to
print
it, to mail it, the whole thing. So far, that's we're doing that okay. It's not it's not big money or anything, but we're surviving.
Yeah, awesome. And do you have any other projects besides that going on? Any book projects coming up?
Well, just the radio show.
Yeah,
I do put a fair amount of work into that, and constantly trying to think of how to come across with that. It's not live now. We're not in the studio anymore. We're not.
Oh, right.
CU station, so it's pre-recorded. But that's easy. It's easy to do, but then you don't have the feedback. Somebody can't pick up the phone and tell you
that was one of my favorite parts about it.
Probably in September we'll get back to that.
Cool.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for asking.
Yeah.
What is the next chapter for Rewild Portland?
Well, we've got we basically have shifted a lot of our programming. We started out just doing ancestral skills stuff, and then started integrating the philosophy behind rewilding, and now we're really shifting towards regenerative, ecological restoration, but through the lens of rewilding. So what that means is basically planting back native landscapes, but also edible and medicinal and craft, and kind of just trying to understand all of that stuff and how to work with indigenous people here in that process. I've been a member of the Grand Ronde language community for over 10 years now. So I've got a connection to the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde there. And so we partner with some of the folks from there to do different programs and to bring some of their knowledge to ours.
Wow, tremendous.
It's just been a really great sort of relationship building project to learn the language and, help out where I can with parts of the language. So I think just continuing to really build those relationships is the most important thing to me. And, in that endeavor, we now have a nursery in Portland where we're growing plants that we can give out to people. We have like a plant sale to help fund it, but then that funding goes to grow plants that basically we give away to a lot of different native projects that are happening in and around the area, not just to Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. There's a lot of other projects that are involved in different native communities here that aren't necessarily native to this specific place, but like the Native American Youth and Family Association, they also have a garden, and we do volunteer stuff out there as well. So just kind of really trying to tie the communities together around these ideas and really, I think, get people behind this idea of rewilding and primal anarchy through the lens of just like subsistence and crafting, but also deep philosophy and really kind of rethinking the way people understand the world. So, yeah. That's what we've got going on.
All right. Wow, it's
There's a lot of random stuff, that we do. It's hard to sort of hold it all together, but yeah.
Wow.
Cool.
Hugely important. Can I just stick in another plug for my
Absolutely.
Just officially came out last week, When We Are Human. It's a collection of essays.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah. Where can people find that?
Well, it's from Feral House.
Cool.
You can go to their website,
Awesome.
Feral House.
Sweet.
I hope it is, kind of widely available. We'll see.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And
really good.
I look forward to the live, for you returning live to the radio show.
I appreciate this. It's been too long since we got to talk.
Yeah, for sure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Rewilding podcast. Check out the show notes for links to support my guests and for select topics we discussed. The podcast is made possible by support from my patrons on Patreon. Patrons get access to podcasts 2 weeks early, can ask me questions about rewilding that I will answer in a patron prompt podcast, and I've just begun releasing an audio version of Rewild or Die, with contemporary commentary and criticisms just for patrons. If you enjoy my work and want to see it continue, become a patron for as little as $1 a month. Thanks so much.